Hi, I'm Urmi, editor here at Move Smartly. Today, I'm pleased to present the third interview in our series on the supply side zoning, planning, social, and political issues that are cited as being one of the key drivers of the Toronto area's housing affordability crisis. In many ways, my chat with Eric Lombardi has been one of the most instructive I've had recently for a couple of reasons. First, as a key leader in Toronto's YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard movement, and in the More Neighbours Toronto volunteer advocacy group, Eric is very knowledgeable and thoughtful about how things need to change if we are to build the number of homes that experts say we need to, if we are to make a dent in easing our housing affordability crisis in many sectors. And that includes the market sector, affordable sector, and shelter sector. His view is well embodied by the More Neighbours Toronto call to action that, quote, every level of government can do more. But second, and perhaps even more importantly, Eric is part of the very population that politicians, industry professionals, and even society at large claims to be most worried about when it comes to the market of housing unaffordability crisis. The young professional who chooses to contribute to Toronto's economy and wants to live in its vibrant city. Eric actually works in the finance sector in Toronto, so he is not someone employed in the housing industry or even adjacent, but rather a passionate citizen advocate. I think this makes his voice one that is particularly important to listen to. Now, a note on timing. The conversation that we had was recorded earlier this month, and while Eric and I do chat about the then upcoming Toronto mayoral elections, I asked Eric to share his views on all candidates and to share more broadly what he thinks has to happen next at the City Hall level so that our conversation remains useful to you, although we've already gone to the polls here. You can find links to all the documents and websites we mentioned in the show notes for this episode. If you find, and you can, sorry about that, you can also find our links to our podcast if you prefer to listen to this episode there. If you find our channel informative, please hit the subscribe button and share this show with other viewers. It's very much appreciated. And now on to our show. All right. Well, welcome everybody to our Move Smartly channel. I'm Urmi, editor here at Move Smartly. I'm really excited to have with us our guest, Eric Lombardi. Eric is going to be, I think, the third speaker in our series of experts that we've been talking to about the zoning changes that have been happening in Toronto and in Ontario and what impacts we think they might have on the housing crisis that we're seeing, and both in terms of affordability and supply. So we're going to get all into that. Hi, Eric. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. So your Twitter handle, your Twitter handle describes you as a thoughtful guy in tech, champion of progress, YIMBY, and links to the volunteer group More Neighbours Toronto. So could you tell us more about yourself, first off, who you are, where you live, your career, and what makes you so passionate about Toronto housing issues?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot. So I'll get started. For me personally, I'm a 29-year-old and I live in downtown Toronto in the Corktown neighborhood. I'm a management consultant, an independent one, focused on financial services and specifically within that management and technology consulting. Now, I'm also the founder and advocate with More Neighbours Toronto, which is a volunteer-only, not-for-profit advocacy organization that is really just committed to the goal of ending the housing crisis in Toronto, Ontario, and I think Canada at that point as well, given the spillover effects our regional crisis has on the entire country. I'm really passionate about housing issues. I'm not necessarily oriented with my career, but because I think this is the number one thing that we as a society are getting wrong. I do think that allowing the crisis to continue is going to diminish our quality of life in the future in so many ways, and makes it so much more challenging to address other collective action problems, whether it's related to mental health and addictions, to the climate crisis, to our stagnant productivity and economic prosperity. And so for me, this issue is really passion driven. I often feel like if there's one issue that I can make the biggest impact, it's this one.
Great. That's great to hear a little bit more about your background. And so can you tell us a little bit more about that organization you mentioned, More Neighbours Toronto?
Yeah. So we launched More Neighbours Toronto in July 2021. So we're not quite 2 years old now. And the goal is really to organize a lot of the grassroots energy around, I'd say, like the pro-housing movement in a way that gave it some identity and also an ability to interface with other civil society and political organizations in a way that they are more used to. A lot of the what I call the YIMBY movement started in California, in San Francisco. And I was actually living there for a while at the time. And I moved back to Toronto, and I saw there was a lot of anger about this issue, but there wasn't a lot of organizing, a lot of people who were angry. And so that was really the impetus to create More Neighbours with help from others who are also angry. And they've been our fundamental volunteers, of course. And really the goal is to show up when people are listening. So it's everything from attending development meetings, particularly ones that have an affordability component or a shelter component to it. So, we've done a lot around the 175 Cummer Avenue shelter site in Willowdale. And when there's opportunities to comment on public policy, whether it's at the municipal, provincial, or federal level, to be able to provide a perspective that is both young and new, but also sorely missing from the debate over the last couple of years. And despite the fact that we are a mostly unfunded organization, I think we've raised through donations of some of the volunteers, maybe $2,500 in the 2 years. I think we've done a very good job at engaging the different realms of civil society and politics, just based on the messaging and the quality of content that we provide.
You certainly have, and that's why I'm talking to you today. It's a voice that has been noticed. I'm putting up a screenshot here of that website. We'll have links to Eric's Twitter and also the More Neighbours Toronto website in our show notes. One thing I really like, Eric, is you had some very good, clear messaging on your website, which you don't always see your organization website, around this idea that you are not, so YIMBY, let's unpack that. Yes, in my backyard. So This is something that our viewers will be familiar with. People that are proponents of this position argue that it's densification that we need to look at, particularly in the already more densely populated areas of Toronto, if we are to get out of this crisis. Now, let me break down why YIMBY connects to solving the housing crisis. So it seems to me there's two parts. First of all, it's if you increase supply, meaning there are just more places for people to live, the argument goes that you would expect prices to come down. Now, are you talking about prices for rents, prices for ownership, or prices for affordable housing? Which one of these, affordable housing, again, the difference there is it's not necessarily at market rates. So the first two categories I'm describing at market rates, rents or buying. And then the third, equally, if not more important category, is affordable housing. Are you focused on any one bucket in your activities?
This is a great question. And so the way I see the housing crisis is actually three crises that waterfall over into one another. The first is the crisis on the market housing. And so this is really what should be targeted towards middle class, upper middle class, even affluent individuals and their ability to afford quality spaces to live in our city at reasonable prices. And we've seen this huge divide generationally in the ability to access housing from a market perspective. The second category is what I'll call workforce affordable housing. So this is as a result of the housing crisis in market, the fact that we still need a lot of critical roles in our society to be also proximate to the neighborhoods that are no longer affordable. So this is really about creating opportunities for nurses, teachers, social workers, et cetera. And then you have the waterfall into what I'd call the deeply affordable space, which is those who, at no matter how great the market is at addressing what I'd call like affordability or attainability, that they will always require some form of assistance from the government and not-for-profit providers, and as like a fundamental social support. So you're looking at shelters, transitional housing, et cetera. And while often the conversation in this space is about market housing, all three of these areas are connected, because when you create challenges for that market affordability, you create more demand and need to have that I'd say, workforce affordable housing. And when you're not doing enough of that, you create more demand for the shelter and transitional housing. And when you're not doing enough of that, people end up on the streets and with the decreasing living standards in general. And in a lot of ways, that's what we've seen. And so the Yes in My Backyard movement is often associated with what I'd call like market housing advocacy. And I think this is more emblematic of the States. I think in Canada, YIMBY also means like yes to workforce affordable housing in our backyards, yes to shelters in our neighborhoods, particularly the neighborhoods that are wealthier, that have often got away with having the city plan all these support and services to be concentrated in poorer neighborhoods as well. And so we really want to upend the decades of public policy that have really people zoned our city and created an affordability crisis, because we've concentrated where growth is allowed to happen and protected a lot of the wealthy brand-oriented housing from much change at all.
Thanks. That's helpful. And I like that you're making those links. I think that's something that needs to be emphasized. Now, let's unpack a little bit more. When you talk about the YIMBY approach to it, it suggests, let's talk about the blockages, the reasons why you think we're not seeing enough units, whether it starts with the market housing for ownership, and then for rent probably covers more of the professional workforce that you're talking about, people that may rent, not always be in a position to own where they work or near where they work. And then, of course, the knock-on effects you're talking about. Now, when we talk about YIMBYs, it suggests to me that the number one reason you think this building is not happening is residents associations or other people coming to meetings and saying no to either the building of a multiple unit condo, multiple unit apartment building, and then the other category, which we see a lot of people getting concerned and activated around, is when there's a proposal for affordable shelter to come in. And often people say, oh, I'm okay with family shelters, but this one is for, single male people with addiction or male identifying people with addiction issues. And that's the one, that's the one that makes me concerned. So are you saying the biggest stumbling block that we've seen to supply so far are these citizen or organizational groups? Or do you think there's more? Do you think there's a bigger story behind that?
I hear this all the time, right? Like, oh, the groups showing up to fight like an individual development, they're not directly causing the problem. Counselors will tell me, well, they've never stopped a single development from going forward, right? But it's actually about the political economy and then how public policy reflects what our legislators are hearing from well-organized groups, right? So if you look at how we plan the city, a lot of the rules which imply biases have been implemented because these citizen groups have made clear to their politicians that they have some organizational clout that will be important for re-election. And so that influence works itself into public policy that has made it increasingly harder and more expensive to build all the other kinds of housing that we need. And so is it the number one challenge? But oftentimes the resistance to the reforms is out of fear of the arguments and the feelings that these type of organizations represent of the general public. I realize that's a little bit more of a nuanced answer, but to me, that's what's more insidious. Like, it's not the individual groups itself, it's the way that those perspectives influence public policy that results in worse housing outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, so I think that's clear. The argument you're making there is that these groups, it's not just the project, it's the outsized influence they have on culture and what we think is normal or right. So let's talk about that a little bit more concretely. In Toronto, we saw that City Council just approved a major change to zoning, and our viewers will be familiar, but again, to go over that, the chief planner put forward the proposal to allow units of up to 4 units of housing on single family lots, you can say, and to make that zoning allowed all across Toronto. And the reason why this is important is because in what was called the Yellow Belt, which covers a lot of the inner burbs of Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, and parts of East York, there was a a bit of a protection. And this might speak to some of the groups and some of the reasons why politicians were protecting single and semi-detached family homes. So single detached and semi-detached homes is the primary mode of housing allowed. That was challenged. That has now been approved by council. And a lot of people are calling this the fourplex thing. So Eric, tell us about this change, your group's involvement, and why you think this change matters.
So I think what's important about this change is that it's taking us from 0 to 1 on a perspective of what all these other neighborhoods that have been protected for so long from multifamily housing, what it means, right? It by no means takes us to 10 or even 100, but sometimes that first step is the hardest. In the multiplex legislation, what they've done is move to a form-based rural system for this kind of housing. Whereas previously, the vast majority of Toronto actually has different regulations around what you can build based on the pre-amalgamation rules of the city over 20 years ago. And so they've done away with things like floor space index, which limits the buildable area on a lot. And so in a lot of neighborhoods, for example, in Etobicoke, they use FSI to limit the amount of space that can be built regardless. In some areas as low as 0.35. And that makes it very infeasible to build this kind of housing on those properties. And so what they've done away with is to say, no, you can build up to 10 meters or essentially 3 stories in height, and you can put 4 units and you can go back 19 meters. And so that standardizes things across the city. You know, there are other neighborhoods like in Scarborough where a lot of the maximum building heights are, 8, so really only allowing up to 2 stories. But this is really just a small step. It'll make this type of housing viable in some neighborhoods, but I'd say the wealthiest neighborhoods and the ones with the most land for the property, this change is not going to make feasible multiplexes in those neighborhoods. And so in a lot of ways, this is really just a stepping stone, and we do need to go further, particularly in the wealthiest neighborhoods where the economics of the rules that are allowed will never work for converting the properties.
And okay, so I'm going to break it down in 2 things. So one, I'm hearing you don't think this will, overall, let's just take Toronto as a whole. Do you think this will add to supply in a meaningful way?
It'll add to supply. All addition to supply is meaningful. I wouldn't say it's going to be a significant driver of supply. And what's a shame is that it should be, right? So if you look at Toronto, just the city of Toronto, there's about 500,000 single family homes in the city overall. So let's just say 1 in 10 becomes a fourplex over the next 10 years, which is really not a very significant change at like the neighborhood level. That would imply a net new 150,000 homes, which is more than half of the target goal for the city. This law comes nowhere to making that type of achievement viable. And so, like I said before, very important to go from 0 to 1 on this. But if we really want to have a significant impact, not just a meaningful one, we're going to have to go further than we have.
And that's exactly, so you've led me to my next question. So the question is twofold. One, if there's not enough supply being built through these changes, then prices aren't going to come down in that old, the traditional supply and demand equation. But I want to talk to you or challenge you on another thing, which is, it seems like no matter how much more supply is introduced, we often leave out of the equation the financialization or the finance aspect of it. Now, you've already pointed out that home prices, or what we call family lot prices, are so high in so many areas of Toronto that buying that land or house and creating these dwellings would result in a cost that would put it well out of the range of affordability, even at market prices for many people, to whether it's to buy. I've even heard that I've attended a conference last week or 2 weeks ago with more small builder and finance industry professionals, the Missing Middle Summit, which was at the Broadview Hotel in East End, Toronto, a couple of weeks ago. And the pro formas, or the when you run the numbers on the math of putting up these buildings, suggests that even if you rented these units out, whether it's a stacked town or duplex, you're probably renting at the upper end of market rents, just so these builders can recoup their costs or make a go of it. And even then, these builders would be making a long-term play. They would actually have to be in the game for about 20, 25 years to see the full cost of their investment returned. So my question is this just a fancy way of some of us, in a way that, some have criticized garden suites or laneway housing as being a fancy little project that some of us might do if we can get the capital, but really it's not quite vanity. That's not fair. And I appreciate that it does push culturally on the notion of what should be where.
Yeah.
But is it just a champagne kind of leftist solution?
It's not. And I'll tell you the truth that I often hate these arguments because I do think that they miss really key points, right? The first one is those neighborhoods are not affordable today, right? They're not even close to affordable. And so when you build this new space, even though these are new condos or apartments in these neighborhoods, they're still actually usually less expensive than to buy or rent the neighboring single family home. So relatively speaking, the affordability of that neighborhood is coming down. The second thing is a new car is always more expensive than a used car. And a large part of the reason why we're in the crisis that we have in housing today is because we didn't build enough housing 20 years ago, right? And so in a lot of ways, we're playing catch up. And then we have the indisputable fact that we are growing so quickly, right? We welcomed 455,000 permanent residents last year. If you look for the really uncapped temporary residents, so looking at students and temporary foreign workers, there's actually an additional 200,000. So last year we completed 80,000 net new units for 700,000 people. The need to house people is an inescapable fact of this problem, and we cannot keep up with population growth without building more housing. Rich people do not evaporate because you don't build housing for them. They simply take housing that could have otherwise been used by people who aren't as wealthy, so the middle classes and then the working classes, and make it their own. And then who gets pushed out at the end of this really messed up game of musical chairs? It's the poor and those who need supports. And so we need to build housing for them. The other thing I often hear about financialization is about, these condo units, they're being sold to investors. Well, here's the other challenge. Think of yourself as a family, right? Or even as an individual. How many people are making the housing choices for their future on 5 to 10 year timelines that it takes to build these large projects? Really the only ones that are allowed to go forward in the city. It's not a realistic timeline for residents to decide on housing. And so by nature of the policies that direct so much of our housing to be this type of form, we have created an investor project. And the absence of the public investment in purpose-built rental, the utilization of its land to do mixed market with affordable units on its properties, really this absence of our social responsibility to the working class and the poor, these investors are the only ones who created net new units for rent. And rent would probably be even higher if not for them. And so when we talk about financialization, we have to also talk about the incentives that are in play for everyone who's participating in what is not truly a free market and their behaviors. And so, what I usually like to challenge on this is, this helps actually make the low-rise neighborhoods more attainable. Will it address workforce affordability? No. That's where we need the CMHC to come in and incentivize some of those units to be created at affordable markets. That's where we need potentially a public builder or at least public financing to help do that, right? There's been a wistful thinking that we can burden new buyers with this for a very long time. And now we're realizing that taxing housing like a sin means you get less of it, which is, the point of any type of sin tax. And so I think we're at this point of reconciling that housing is a social good, even if new housing is not quote unquote affordable. It does ensure that existing housing, is not being occupied by those who are more affluent. And so overall, that should create more affordability in the units that are already existing. The final note that I want to make on this is that if we want to end the speculative investment in this industry, we need to make predicting the value increase of a property is not going to go up if it's built. What we need the investment to be driven into is I can make money on building net new housing. And if that happens, then prices will remain flat, but more housing will get built. And then we're going to end the speculation in the industry, because the incentive of just speculating on the upward value of a property without doing anything to it isn't going to be there. So that type of market dynamic has to be the outcome of public policy. And I think a lot of people struggle to understand that or see that.
So I want to live where you are proposing. Some really good points made there, but we are very far from the kind of thing you're saying. Yes. And so I appreciate it though. Now you've mentioned more government. What I'm hearing is government getting into actually building or providing funding in a more active way than they are currently. So before I get to that, and it's important right now because our viewers will be watching this right after the outcome of a Toronto election, but the issues raised in the mayoral election will continue to be important. So let's get right back to that. But before we do, I just want to get on to the last point. Presumably you don't want all these new units in rich neighborhoods just to stick it to the rich. What is it about putting more units into some of these rich low-rise neighborhoods? I'm suspecting it's because they're desirable because of a lot of the infrastructure, but I don't want to presume. Maybe you just want to stick it to the rich.
I actually just totally agree with you, right? The value of the property in the neighborhood reflects the desirability to live there. And our most expensive neighborhoods tend to be infrastructure and transit abundant. And so it's not just about sticking it to the rich, but I think the wealthy have been huge beneficiaries of this challenge. And, asking the richest neighborhoods to accommodate more, I think, is a form of social justice. I mean, if you look at the bridle path and the zoning that exists for it, right? They're half acreage to acreage lots by default that have a floor space index of I think 0.25. So the public policy has zoned these neighborhoods to be gated communities. So part of it is actually sticking it to those who've secured the government protecting their social ecosystem. That has to be a part of the conversation, right? So, we talk a lot about gentrification. Well, it's not gentrification if you build housing where the gents are, right? And I do think that that's a form of social justice.
And what do you say to the argument that one of the things that makes some of these areas really desirable is, in a sense, some of the lower footprints, so you have more tree canopy, and the argument that they tend to be seen as the safer neighborhoods in town. So the desirability of these neighborhoods, the very thing that you're trying to get more people into enjoying, may in itself be threatened by getting more people into it.
I don't think that's true at all. I think the most exciting neighborhoods to live in, and I think a lot of people would agree with this, are those that actually have more mixed income residents, right? They end up having stronger bases for local businesses and small businesses. They end up having better social culture, more entertainment and community events. If you want to live on an acreage, go move to Vaughan or Caledon. You don't need to, you can't choose all the amenities that you get from living so close to all the amenities of this major and fantastic to live center of this metropolitan region, which is Toronto, and also get your pastoral paradise, right? Maybe that shouldn't be the optimization of government and public policy. And, frankly, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, like I desire living in these neighborhoods someday. The vast majority of people will never be able to afford to live in these neighborhoods. So how do we improve the quality of life and type of neighborhoods everyone gets to live in overall? This is how, right? Bring people to where the neighborhoods have those attributes and build more housing. And yes, you can respect a lot of those environmental attributes of these neighborhoods as well. It truly is not a trade-off.
And are there any examples in Toronto right now, a couple neighborhoods that you think embody what you would like to see more of?
I don't think there's any neighborhood in Toronto that embodies what I'd like to see more of. We have some older neighborhoods where they look like a good future for other neighborhoods, but a lot of those neighborhoods themselves have not grown in the way that we've seen. So, if you look at somewhere like Riverside, which is a lot more dense than the rest of the city.
It's my hood, our hood, Riverside, Leslieville here, right?
Yeah.
So that, just for our viewers, that's Queen Street east of the DVP.
Yeah, or even Beaches East York, right, where you do have some of this like mixed housing that was grandfathered in after we made it illegal. Mm-hmm. This is a really good path for a lot of Scarborough, Etobicoke neighborhoods, North York neighborhoods that are still far less dense. But the challenge with neighborhoods like Riverside and Leslieville is that they've actually shrunk since 1971. There are fewer people living in them today, and they have even the Danforth, right, access to this awesome public infrastructure. We've got Line 2, we've got streetcar lines going through them. They are also not an appropriate level of density, and that will need to change in those neighborhoods as well. So we have neighborhoods in Toronto that reflect what the evolution of other neighborhoods could look like. But the vast majority of neighborhoods are not evolved to where they need to address this crisis.
What an interesting point you're making. It's funny because anecdotally, you hear about these thriving restaurants that people raise their families on, whether in the Danforth area, in the India Bazaar area, further down on Gerrard, East Gerrard. And then you think of the small businesses and the restaurants now and how that footfall, in spite of a lot of, what seems like new buildings going up around, isn't there.
Yes.
So that's an interesting point you're making. And I think one thing that will need to be calculated into the mix is the falling size of households. So it's not just that you're adding units, that you have to add even more, because, the way I grew up, presumably maybe the way you did, we grew up when new relatives came, initially they would live with us and then move out and find their own house. So, you're talking about changes in behavior, I think, too. So there's a lot more to talk about. I'm going to get you on in future episodes to talk about that. But let's now turn to the second part of what you were talking about, which is you are basically saying there's going to have to be more lifting done by government directly. And I'm wondering what you think that looks like, whether you've heard anyone talk about anything in the Toronto mayoral elections or that comes close to what you're talking about.
Yeah. So there are two ways for government to get involved and where they need to be. The first one I'll say is the market side, which really just means like land reform, zoning reform, process reforms, like make it easier for private industry to build housing. The second area it needs to get involved is with directly investing in building housing itself. And so, the most immediate need is really at that deeply affordable, the one of the three crises that I talked about earlier. They need to get involved in a very direct way. And, the nearest term is really just, give people money to find rental because we don't have the shelter capacity right now. Like that is the fastest way to help those individuals directly. The second is investing directly in the deeply affordable units and also the programming and wraparound services that they need. The second one is to really leverage its own land and yes, long-term capital to build mixed cash flow positive over its lifetime developments that have a large component of either a deeply affordable or workforce affordable perspective. We hear a lot about public builders. People like to build up Vienna a lot. I am fully in support of having a public builder. And I actually think overall for the economy, it would be good to have, because you can start by capitalizing it. And you can do some planning around the projects and phase them, curate talent in-house, and consistently build housing over time. You reclaim that value back over time as well, which allows you to build increasing amounts. But another good thing that you can do is when you enter periods of economic challenge, like a recession, et cetera, you usually have lower interest rates on government debt. And so you can capitalize those institutions even more during that period and accelerate the development and plans that they have so that they keep the entire workforce that's building housing upskilled, right? So that you don't see layoffs or pauses, et cetera. And so this actually helps us consistently build an institution that can become more important over time. The thing about institution building in this way is that it's not an instant solution to the problem, but it is an incredibly important solution 20 years from now. But we have to plant that seed today and build the institution now so it can be effective. Turning towards the mayoral race. I would say, John Tory, particularly later on in his term, was really starting to focus on housing issues, which was good. They started the Housing Action Plan, which, is directionally good, even if its magnitude is not as far as we're going to need to go. I don't think in particular that John Tory cast a very large shadow from a visionary perspective. And so even though I think the majority of leading contenders for the mayoral race will be as good, if not better than John Tory, I have been a little bit surprised that very few seem to have wanted to step out of what I would call that small amount of shade that he cast on this file. And so there have been some excellent ideas. Mitzi Hunter, Josh Matlow have really put emphasis and details into their vision for the public role in the solutions here, right? Josh Matlow is really focusing on public builder, and like I said, Mitzi Hunter is as well. Mitzi has also done a very good job on some of the other market-oriented reforms as well, but you can tell that her bread and butter is really with what the government's actions should be doing. Anna Bilo and Brad Bradford, despite being on council for a long time, are very knowledgeable and have been leaders on this issue. It's very easy to talk about accountability, like, oh, well, why didn't you do the things? But council is not a dictatorship. And frankly, there has been a history of a lot of councillors, not these ones, really pushing back against the reforms that we need. And so, Brad and Anna have actually pushed the needle wherever they could when they were on council. And I think that does make them somewhat trustworthy if they were going to become mayor on this issue as well. Olivia Chow does say a lot of good things as well. So, I've been optimistic to hear what I have from her, and she is a front runner. I think her and her team are downplaying the importance of the market-oriented reforms. I think they could also be bolder on what they would even do on the public and the role of government. But I would say it seems like they are running a frontrunners campaign where sometimes saying too much, why say too much when you're already ahead on the subject? I will also say that I was pleasantly surprised by the Mark Sanders campaign. I really thought with Stephen Holliday's endorsement that it was going to be pretty rough on the housing promises, but his campaign has actually signaled, particularly on the role for government, that they are open to these things. They do want to emphasize the role of federal government as well, removing HST from purpose-built rentals and affordable housing, trying to access more capital so the city can do better, make its own land available, et cetera. I do think that his position on taxes, same with Bradford's and Anna's, make it really hard for the city to say, and them to say that we're going to invest in these areas when, really they're going to be talking about what we need to cut from a service and investment perspective if they want to balance our $1.6 billion deficit. And so that's really where I'm skeptical with some of the candidates. And I'd say what's disappointing overall is that no one has really gone deep on this issue. I would have liked to see more talking about, ending the apartment ban, like allowing, these smaller apartments and even small businesses to be allowed in neighborhoods again, and really to, create that fabric and vitality that a lot of people actually like in their communities. I really do think it was a lost opportunity for a campaign to not capitalize and focus on this issue and the anger around it. But maybe that's because I'm biased as a housing advocate.
Well, I must say, you must have a lot of friends, because I'm feeling more optimistic. When I was looking at this landscape and feeling a little bit depressed when I think of Toronto's potential housing future. You've laid out some really good points. It sounds like
optimistic, but there's a reason to feel depressed, because
yes,
promised the scale of change that's necessary. And particularly on housing issues, the elephant in the room is the province and them not being willing to even really make way on their own housing affordability task force, right? Like, Toronto is just one city. And if every city in their entire region embarked on the housing action plan that Toronto is doing, we would probably be halfway to where we need to go, which is significant progress, but it doesn't get us to the tilting point where things just stop going out of control, right? And I think often, as a supply advocate, and you look at the numbers, you talk to Mike Moffat, et cetera, it's a dire situation, and we really need to double the rate of housing that we're building to accommodate it. So every major candidate in this election is likely going to be like John Tory or better on this issue, which is reason for optimism, because later into his mandate, he was becoming a lot better. It is still not far enough, and there are still plenty of reasons to be cynical, I promise.
Well, I know a lot of them. Maybe I'm a little bit older than you. Let's talk about Toronto's involvement in housing when the city has been directly involved. Not good news stories. The Toronto Housing Now action plan. How many units has it actually yielded? I understand it close to zero.
Yeah.
Or zero.
Yeah.
And then I'd like to hear your comments on that, but then also the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, which is just, made Toronto, the city, one of the worst landlords ever. We talk about more affordable housing. The housing we have is in such disrepair that we should be embarrassed as Torontonians, because we are really the worst landlords. People are living in condemned buildings where things fall off and on people. And so more city involvement in housing.
Yeah.
Why does that fill me with fear?
So here's the main problem with the housing now. I think I would suggest you talk to Mark Richardson, who leads the accountability group for that specifically, because he's brilliant. But the main thing is, the city tried to build housing corresponding with all of its rules, right? And they've learned that it's actually not viable to do so in that way. And Toronto also tried to become a leader. So the first thing I think that we need to do is we need to simplify the rules that apply to most sites in most cases, right? So, if you look at one of the Housing Now sites in City Place, the proposed height was 27 stories and shorter than every private development around it, because they were just trying to adhere to the city plan. But every developer came in and requested a zoning change for more height and density to make their projects work. So it's things like this where, like, the city has handicapped itself in delivering affordable housing. So if they're going to go with this model, what I would suggest is have a public land bank where you do want to optimize for certain goals, and then allow not-for-profits and even for-profit developers to partner on building the units and allow them to come in with the proposals and be less rigid in all of the requirements, and having it be city-led or city-driven, right? We just haven't set up a public building institution that is really capable of delivering housing. And so I would move the entire program to be responsive more than prescriptive with how the city's land gets used in this fashion. now am forgetting the second part of the question. Apologies.
No, I think that's a good one and a good response. The second one was just a very dire record of a community housing corporation.
Right. So I'd say like the reason why it's in the state of repair as it is because we literally have not, we have not invested in maintaining it. And that's kind of the problem with a bit of our culture these days is like, we're happy to build net new infrastructure. I live in Corktown, we have a beautiful new park. And in some ways it's already falling because we built it and the developments around it build it, but then it goes into cities' operations and maintenance, and then we don't really maintain it.
Can I just jump in with a little secret as a former civil servant from Infrastructure Ontario? This is one of the biggest issues from the Ministry of Infrastructure. People love to announce and cut ribbons and present things. People do not like to allocate operational budgets to keeping things up because that means trying to get the money from somewhere. So I urge every single citizen, please, whatever you vote, whoever you vote for, let them start talking about operating budgets. It is extremely important. Okay, that's my PSA, done.
It's important because it's exactly what's happened with TCHC, because it is always easier to pay for the maintenance of property and infrastructure than it is to pay for the replacement. But because politicians don't, it's not glamorous to have high quality garbage cans that don't look terrible and to like empty them on time, right? Like, can't cut a ribbon on that, but people experience the city in the way, and we all know that quality is going down. But to bring it back to TCHC, the budget and allocation has not been there. I will also say that Toronto is the only municipality with its owned public housing infrastructure, right? The rest is actually from the province. And so, if we're going to do this here because we have the need for it, but I actually do think the need is regional. The provincial government does truly need to be more involved from a capitalization and operational capacity for it, just due to its ability to raise revenues is more flexible than what Toronto has. Doesn't justify Toronto's neglect of it, because we do have proportionately the lowest tax rates in the entire province from a property tax perspective. But I will say one good thing on TCHC. And Anna Bilau does deserve a lot of credit for this. Towards the end, in the last council term, they did secure $2.6 billion in capital funding through the federal government to update and enhance TCHC buildings. And they have started progress in a lot of ways on these things. So, I don't think we're gonna get a lot of net new TCHC housing over the next period of time. But I do think that we will have an opportunity over the next 5 to 10 years to actually make it not as terrible as it is.
Yeah, so I can take worst landlord ever off my CV as a citizen.
There is good things happening on that specifically. We're not going far enough.
Well, I appreciate that. Your knowledge is fabulous. We're running out of time. You're going to come back, I hope. Because there's so much more to talk about. Before we end, let's turn a little bit more to the province. So the other policy changes we've seen introduced by the Ford government late last year is the Build Homes More Faster. I always think there's a grammatical problem with, or is it Build Homes Faster Act? And I want to, sorry, I'm making it a grammatical problem. Anyway, I want to just get your quick thoughts on that legislation. Now, my past interview with Phil Pothen goes into why that's a real change away from the previous pieces of legislation the province was governed under, the Places to Grow Act, and just hear your thoughts on it. And then I'm going to just end with a few questions about whether we are crowding out localization. If we want more authority from the city and the province to be telling us what to do, are we taking away the right of communities to build to their needs? So first, a comment on the government's Ford's new legislation.
Lots of stuff here. So, I will say that coming into this mandate that the Ford had with the previous government, the Housing Affordability Task Force had come forward and really put an excellent set of proposals together. And during the election, they said, this is going to be our roadmap. They have done very little of that. So they're kind of like, hey, we had some experts come in and weigh in on what we need to do. Oh, that wasn't what we wanted to hear. Okay, throw that in the trash bin, right? And so, what the Ford government is doubling down on is saying it's actually too hard for us to do the legislative changes to encourage that densification of an infill development in existing built up areas. And so what they're saying is, okay, we're going to make it easier to build on greenfield, and we're going to make the green belt less of an untouchable area of land. And this is something I disagree with. Some of it is similar to Phil for environmental reasons, but I actually disagree with it largely for economic reasons. We all complain about high taxes and like low quality of services in this region. And a large part of that is because we've built so much of it in low density with a lot of infrastructure, right? Which is more proportionate to land area than density overall. That all we would be doing is doubling down on a model that's going to create, those additional operational, maintenance, and repair costs over the long term, costs that we're already not spending enough money on. So over the long term, we're going to create an even higher tax society with worse services as a result. One thing I will say though, is the government is right that the Places to Grow Act constrained the land that was available for building. And because at that time, the governing Liberals didn't make it easier to build in most existing neighborhoods, that actually meant there was a very small amount of land that were actually buildable. A lot of this land loaned by real estate investment trusts and large wealthy owners, because these are plazas, these are brownfield sites, etc. And you constrained artificially the supply of land available for housing, driving up the cost of all those lands. So there has to be acknowledgement that when you are artificially constraining the land available, you have to adopt other policies that don't force the value of land to go up, particularly land that's already held by very wealthy institutions. And then, there are all of the environmental reasons that Phil will go into detail, and he's absolutely correct about it. But this is not the pattern of development that's actually going to create a prosperous society where we have high quality services and we're not taxed to death to have them. And so, that's really what I would emphasize to listeners is, that sprawl isn't going to address the fact that the demand to live is in neighborhoods that are already connected to jobs, services, entertainment, communities, and all that existing infrastructure. Like, it has to be in those places. And, the government's own expert panel talked about the economics of this in its report to the government. So, really, passing the buck type of attitude coming from the current provincial government, which I'm actually very disappointed in, because I really did think that they were going to move on the recommendations from that task force. I believe there was one more point that
the second part was, so I assume from your response that you would like to see more legislation at the provincial level, or action at the provincial level, to push not only Toronto, but as you've talked about regionally, it's a big symbiosis, the GTA and beyond, to be pushed to adopt measures that would accelerate building of houses. Now, the criticism of that, and of Places to Grow before, from mayors and leaders of municipalities, is that what you were actually doing is becoming very top down and taking away the ability of local communities to build according to their own needs. And this is a very common debate we have in Canada, right? When the province tells you to do something, or the federal government, the cry from below, because we are a federation, is we're local. You're tying our hands.
Yeah. So here is like my response to that. I think localism is great if they're actually delivering what they need to, which they have not been. Like, local politics has literally gotten us into this situation because the province has yielded to localism, and then localism has said not here, and now we're in a housing crisis. So what I want to see is, yes, if localism can deliver on the housing and infrastructure that we need, then I am fine to let it drive. But if localism fails, there has to be repercussions. And so what there has not been from the provincial level is what happens when localism fails. And that's where the role for the provincial government is. And that's where I would like to see something like what I'd call like a housing remedy, where if, I don't even want to say like Toronto at large, because there's a lot of very unfair ways a large geography of a city can address this crisis. But I'd actually even look at more on like the, I don't want to call it ward level, but smaller or neighborhood level, right? Where if you do not build your allotment of housing over a year or 2 year period, then the default rules go to a provincial standard that allows potentially more housing that you wouldn't want. So the question needs to not be at a localism level. It can't be, do we build housing or not? The question is, how do we build the housing that we have to? And if they can't answer that in a way that builds enough housing, they've lost their right to control for a period. And I think that has to be the way forward. There has to be accountability.
Well, Eric, I've heard more concrete ideas out of you than I think from the whole Toronto election panel combined. So I really appreciate you coming on and unpacking and explaining for us the positions that advocates of density and other positions that your organization holds. You've unpacked it well. You've told us a lot about it. I am going to have you on to talk more. I really want to talk more about the government's capacity as a builder. I was really intrigued by some of the ideas you have. So let's keep this conversation going. Okay. I'll put links to, again, the things that the websites and the things you mentioned. You mentioned Mike Moffat. I also interviewed him earlier. So viewers can see our interview to get an idea of the scale of the housing shortage problem in Ontario. And we are going to talk again, I hope.
I hope so too. Thank you so much for your time and for having me on.
Pleasure. Thanks, Eric.